Well, thank you very much for joining us here on the dialogue between the US, UK, Australia, Israel. It's not formally the US, but we have people who've been part of the dialogue from the US and France and other parts of the world. And it's a great tribute to Albert Adon as our chairman that he's managed to continue the dialogue throughout COVID last year and this year virtually. And before that, of course, many people who are involved with the dialogue met in person, usually in Jerusalem, sometimes in London, sometimes in Australia. But I think mostly we've caught up in Israel, which has been a great privilege and a pleasure for all of us. I'm Christopher Pyne. I'm the former Minister for Defence and many other portfolios in the Howard, Abbott, Morrison and Turnbull governments. It's my great pleasure to be moderating a discussion tonight for about 50 minutes or so on Britain and global Britain, the changing attitude of Britain to the world, particularly since Brexit. And I'm very keen to hear from our panelists today and tonight, depending where you are in the world, about their attitudes towards where Britain is heading in the Indo-Pacific and the rest of the world, its capability, and so forth. So let me welcome our panelists. Very good timing of Teresa Villiers, who's just arrived.
So sorry, I'm a little late.
That's right. It's perfect timing. I was literally filling in while you arrived, and we're very pleased to have Teresa Villiers here, a former Secretary of State in Conservative governments, and Stephen Crabb, also a former Secretary of State in a Conservative government. John Speller, Minister of State in Labor governments, with his extremely exciting background, which we don't want to ask him about because it takes quite a while for him to explain what it means. Mike Gapes, long-standing Member of Parliament from 1992 to 2019, and a very good friend of Israel and a good friend of many of us who are part of this dialogue. So let's get underway. I'll let you catch your breath, Teresa, and I'll pose the first question perhaps to Stephen Crabb. So is Britain ready to have a global focus?
Well, first of all, good morning, Christopher. It's a pleasure to join you again for one of these calls. The answer very succinctly is yes. We are ready. There is a new mindset, I believe, within the UK government, which is permeating through our foreign policy establishment about the new posture that Britain wants to take on the world stage. And I don't think it's an understatement to say it's a new moment. Brexit provides us with a clear strategic opportunity to reassess our direction. As members of the EU, of course, there were legal constraints on things that Britain could do internationally, not least in the realms of trade. But far more than the legal constraints is one I felt was a challenge around mindset, and increasingly Britain's foreign policy position being submerged into a generic EU position. That was one of the big concerns that many of us felt. And so Brexit, leaving the EU, gives us the opportunity to think differently and do things differently. And that will mean making choices about where we want to project the global Britain mission, choices about where we do that and how we do that. It doesn't mean giving up on our friends and partners in the European Union, but we'll have a different working relationship with them. So to be brief, yes, I think we are ready. It doesn't mean that we don't have challenges ahead in terms of how we resource the global Britain mission, in terms of our investment in defence capabilities and all of the other aspects that make up the global Britain brand. But I think we're in a good place in terms of leadership on this.
John Speller, do you think that Britain has the military, has invested enough in its military capability? I mean, I hear what Stephen says about the willingness of Britain to now have a global outlook, but I think I don't want to lecture the Brits about their military capability. However, has Britain invested enough in the last 30 years to be able to meet its ambitions with its capability?
Well, firstly, I mean, frankly, for those not in the UK, what Stephen was saying was bluntly rubbish. The fact is that Britain always had these options within the EU. France has shown you can have an independent foreign policy. You can basically do what you like within the EU. It's about political will. And that's always been one of the problems. By the way, my constituency voted 2-1 to leave. But in many cases, actually, they had options that they could have done. For example, purchasing. All the time, ministers and civil servants told us they couldn't buy British because they were part of the EU. Germans, French, and Italians never constrained by that. And by the way, they're still doing it. We've recently done a massive vaccine order. Where's it going to be manufactured? In Europe, because they will not build up and support British industrial capacity. We briefly started, after all the problems with the pandemic, we started to actually give some orders for personal protection equipment in the UK. Now they're going back to ordering it all from China. And only yesterday we had manufacturers, small manufacturers, saying they won't even let us into the project. I said all along, in all my life in politics, about the EU, those who were against said it was all to do with Brussels. Those who were in favour said Brussels was our salvation. The problems of the UK never lay in Brussels, they lay in Whitehall. And it's still that, because ministers shout and bawl and make gestures, but actually they don't get a grip of the machine. To come to your question, the question, look, we are still an immensely capable, we're not a superpower, but we're an immensely capable military power. The Royal Navy is still a major navy, although we've issued a report called only this week saying we're going to need a bigger navy, and we need to sort out maintenance issues. But we are still a P5 country. We are still we still have a very effective nuclear deterrent. We still have magnificent armed forces, but they have been underinvested, firstly, and also Whitehall has been, in most cases, pretty bad at what they're purchasing. Only today they're going to carry on with an armoured vehicle programme, which has already cost 3.2 billion, and they've had about 10 vehicles out of it. And they've given all the money to the company with nothing delivered. So it is that balance that we still have, like with our economy, with the vaccines, brilliant scientists, and actually a very effective delivery system. But our bureaucracy isn't up to purpose. Bluntly, you remember Tony Blair raising this? He made some reforms. This government also is really not getting to the heart of the problem. So it's a mixed bag. But we've still got some very impressive troops, and also they've got some effective kit, and are one of the few countries that can actually operate out of area. What we need to make sure is, particularly with aspirations for global Britain, that we're able to more effectively be a partner, particularly to the United States, but also to Australia and others.
So, John, is that the multi-role vehicle protected program that you're talking about with armoured vehicles?
This is the Ajax program, and it's lamentably late. It's supposed to deliver between 2017 and 2023, and it is suffering enormously. They've got great problems with noise and also with vibration. They have soldiers are having to be sort of medically stood down because of not being able to use it. And the army have been covering this up, and there needs to be a reckoning on that.
Well, John,
on the other hand, some other programs work well.
You can tell the Secretary for Defence that I did offer them a Hawkeye and Bushmaster for that program some years ago, and they insisted on getting the second-class program.
Yeah, well, you're entitled to say you told us so. By the way, look, for example, if you look at our naval warships, we're doing a cooperative program with yourself on destroyers, along with Canada as well. So there's lots of good things going on, and I don't want to downplay Britain, but I do want to make clear there are some severe structural weaknesses as well.
No, I think that there's lots of really good things going on. And the problem with defence, of course, as you would know, being a minister in that portfolio, is that They're long programs, and they are always fraught with problems. Teresa, we very much welcomed the fleet from the UK that travelled through the Indo-Pacific, not that long ago. In fact, only really a matter of weeks ago, and visited our part of the world. They didn't visit Australia, but they didn't need to, of course. We're about as close as two nations can be. But we did have a recent visit from the Astute class to Perth, and now in the rest of Australia, which is very exciting. In your Johnson government, do you see the Indo-Pacific as being a significant test and a significant part of this new ambition for global Britain? And if so, how do you see that playing out?
I do see the Indo-Pacific as a hugely important focus, should be for the international community, and certainly is for Boris Johnson's foreign policy. He and his new Foreign Secretary have made that very, very clear, and our Carrier Strike Force is a visible emanation of our commitment on that. And we, the global community as a whole, obviously one of the key challenges it faces how to interact with China. And of course, in Australia, you've been very much at the sharp end of that. And I think there are some of us in this country who feel that the UK government was a little slow in catching up in terms of matters such as Huawei, but we are now seeing very much more of a sort of uniform alignment between the UK, Australia, the US on this. And it is going to be, one of the most, difficult foreign policy challenges, because of course, China as a massive economic superpower already, and set to become even bigger and more influential, is a country with which we have to engage closely when it comes to our trade, when it comes to addressing climate change. But we do also have to be very clear-eyed about the risks. And I think a robust approach when it comes to things like protecting our intellectual property, preventing forced transfer of technology, and addressing the security and surveillance risks that come with engagement with China and Chinese companies is going to be crucially important. So the Prime Minister here in the UK has set out a vision for a global Britain foreign policy which is patriotic, which is positive, which is optimistic. And one of the criteria against it will be judged in terms of whether it's successful or not, is this question of how it tackles the UK's relationship with China. And in making a success of that, working with close allies like Australia, like the US, like Israel, is of course going to be very important.
I'm going to come to Mike Gapes on Israel in a minute, but before we leave, Teresa, do you think Britain has the courage, and Stephen might want to comment on this too as a member of the current government, do you think Britain has the courage to decide to base ships or aircraft in Australia, and certainly to pre-position equipment in Australia, all of which would now be available to it under the AUKUS agreement of September this year?
I think it certainly would have the courage to do that if a decision was taken that the circumstances justified it. I'm not aware of any plans to do that, but if it was felt appropriate, within the new AUKUS alliance, then it is something the UK government would consider doing, I imagine, and would certainly have the capability of doing. And one of the reasons why it would is, of course, it is investing more in defence than at any time since the Cold War, including levels of funding which are well above the NATO floor, which we're required to meet, and which, of course, a number of our other NATO allies don't meet. But so that that expands our capability, and it could include the measures that you've floated, but I'm not aware that there are any plans to do that.
Stephen, did you want to comment on that?
Yeah, thanks, Christopher. I'm not sure I've got much to add to what Teresa has said. If you look at the integrated review, which I would encourage all of our viewers to have a look at, which was the document that the UK government published earlier this year, which was the product of a really wide-ranging reassessment of UK foreign policy, defence, overseas aid capabilities and priorities. Basing ships in Australia isn't a feature of that, but it's an evolving scenario that we are dealing with, and clearly the AUKUS pact that Teresa has just referred to is a further evolution of our priorities and where we are focusing. And it could well be that in time, if the risks and the opportunities merit it, that we could see ships there. But I wouldn't want to set any hairs running by pretending that that's a live discussion at this time.
I think it's a long way off. I mean, I think there's an inevitability about now that Australia, the UK and US have made this leap into a much closer arrangement between these three Five Eyes countries, that it will now just continue to expand. Mike, you might like to comment on some of that, but I'd also be keen to know from your perspective whether you feel that a global Britain attitude extends to a different attitude to Israel in the future than has perhaps been evinced in the past, when both Conservative and Labor governments, not Labor governments particularly poor, of course, but Conservative governments too haven't exactly been as embracing of Israel as, say, Australia or the United States has. Do you think global Britain will change attitudes towards Israel and the British government?
Right. Well, thank you, first of all, for the invitation. I was on the Foreign Affairs Select Committee right the way up until I left Parliament in 2019. And we did a series of reports between 2017 and 2019. This is a committee with a Conservative majority, cross-party, and on global Britain and various aspects of it, human rights, British overseas territories, and other issues. And our conclusions were quite critical, actually, from the period when the slogan was first put up there by Theresa May's government, Boris Johnson being Foreign Secretary, to later on, that it was more a slogan with very little substance. Now, some of the substance has developed subsequently with some of the trade deals, which are basically cut and paste jobs, copying the EU trade deals with most of the countries where that's been the case. But I'm quite struck, but there is still a lack of substance. You ask about attitudes of global Britain to the Middle East. This integrated review, which is an important document, which was published recently, doesn't have any reference at all to the Abraham Accords. Now, I think that is absolutely remarkable. Supposedly, we've got the integrated review with different government departments coming together, giving a strategic view of where the UK is going to be. And it doesn't refer at all to the Abraham Accords. So in answer directly to your question, I don't know, because I don't think there is a clear, coherent position yet about what role the UK is going to play. The UK didn't play any role in the Abraham Accords. Britain at this moment isn't doing more than a minimal amount, although we've legislated, we support the International Fund for Israel and Palestinian peace. There is a potential to have seats on the body that administers it. And as I understand it, there is no British government desire yet to take a more active role, proactive role in that. So one welcome piece of news is, of course, that the Labour Party has now got a leader who is very clearly making clear, very much in contrast to his predecessor, that he's going to root out anti-Semitism, and that the Labour Party does not support BDS, and that the Labour Party does not support anti-Zionist racism, and various other things. That's all good news. So there may well be a move back to a more bipartisan approach on these issues. But frankly, I don't yet know where the UK government is on these issues because it's silent.
Teresa, is that a fair criticism of the global Britain, that it lacks substance, that it needs some meat on the bones, or is Mike Gapes just being a bit politically partisan?
No, I don't agree with Mike's description of the situation at all. We've seen a very robust sort of support expressed for Israel by Liz Truss as the new Foreign Secretary. We've seen the strategic partnership announced. We've got very strong relationships between the Israeli government and the UK government. We've seen a clear and decisive decision to boycott Durban 4 events, and also to vote against a number of problematic resolutions in UN fora on Israel. So there is a range of ways in which the UK government is making it very clear of its strong support for Israel, including during the tragic conflict in Israel and Gaza back in May. UK government officials were absolutely adamant of Israel's right to defend itself. And I would also say I don't believe that the Labour Party has fixed all of its problems in this area. It is truly shocking that it, for several years, had a leader who, when he went to an event about Israel at the Labour Party conference, couldn't even bring himself to mention the name of the country. So I think that we have got a really positive story to tell about the UK government working really positively with Israel on trade, on technology, and on foreign policy.
Mike Gapes would like to have another go.
2 points. Firstly, I resigned from the Labour Party over anti-Semitism and other issues, and I sacrificed my political career, went on a kamikaze mission in 2019 because of my opposition to Corbyn and what he was doing to my party. So I'm now no longer a member of the party because I'm excluded. So I'm speaking from outside, and so I'm welcoming what they've done so far. I agree with Teresa. There's more to do. There is the elements of long Corbyn, if I can coin the phrase, which are still there within the Labour Party at different levels. But I think Starmer has got to be given the credit for what he's done so far. Certainly his recent statements have been extremely good on these areas. I think there is a fundamental issue. Of course, Teresa's right. The UK government has done many things, and Foreign Minister Lapid's visit to London was a great success. And the discussions that are going on at the moment about, we're coming to the later panel on this, on Iran, obviously are issues where Israel and the UK are engaged in intensive discussions about this. I, however, go back to my fundamental point, which is the integrated review, which sets out the strategic vision, doesn't mention the Abraham Accords at all. And I suspect there is a lack of focus because of a shift of orientation towards the dealing with the China issue, because of the transatlantic issues, because of the ongoing difficulties with the European Union, the Northern Ireland Protocol, issues with the Biden administration. Because of that the Middle East doesn't feature, and Israel doesn't feature within the panoply of issues that the government is having to deal with. And I think that is regrettable, and that was my main point. But I accept all these other things that are happening, yes, and have happened, that's right. But my main point is about the strategic approach long term, and it's not there.
Stephen, did you look like you wanted to make a comment on that?
Yeah, Christopher, if I could jump in there. I mean, look, the blunt truth is that this current British government has probably closest, deepest, most constructive relationship with Israel of any British government since the State of Israel was founded. It's not just the value of the overall trade that we're doing with Israel. If you look at the components of the trade, it's really strategic stuff: tech, pharma, cybersecurity, defense, and intelligence. Mike rightly referred to the visit of the Israeli foreign minister 2 weeks ago to London. Nobody should understate the importance of the discussions that the Israeli foreign minister had with Boris Johnson and other members of the British government. The Abraham Accords are real. I personally believe that they're one of the most significant foreign policy developments in foreign affairs since the fall of the Berlin Wall. I think there is a fair criticism to be made that perhaps the civil servants within the Foreign Office were too slow to recognize the strategic change that was happening. And partly that was because of a distaste for Trump, right? Let's be blunt about this, because President Trump was so closely associated with the Abraham Accords. I think there was a reluctance to give credit and to recognize the permanency of this. But if you look at all of the developments since the initial announcement of the deal between Israel and the UAE, it's been backed up week after week with visits between the leaders. Prime Minister Bennett from Israel was in UAE this week, and Britain wants to play a role in that. Britain has got historically close relationships with the Gulf states, and I think under Foreign Minister Liz Truss, there is a recognition that there's a really important role for Britain to play in helping to foster that and to make sure that these bear fruit in the years to come.
I think that's fair points to make, especially about Liz Truss and the distaste of most civil servants, unfortunately, across both Australia, the US, and the UK for the Trump administration. John Speller, you wanted to make some comments.
Just briefly, firstly on that, I don't think we should be setting up this sort of dichotomy of Labour against Conservative governments. Governments of both parties have been very strongly involved with Israel. The Blair-Brown government was enormously supportive and engaged with Israel. So I think that's important. But I do want to come back to the defence issue, and I'm not wanting to pour cold water on AUKUS, because I think this has considerable potential, particularly in supply chain issues, which everyone is facing, and in defence is absolutely defence critical. But I think it's going to be very important that we develop that area, and I know there's an interest in the United States, and I think also in Australia. And there's a lot of mutual cooperation, and I hope some of the naval issues that we're going to be dealing with will help to bring that forward. But I do have to say that Britain's primary defence interest was, and in the foreseeable future will be Europe. In other words, Europe and where it borders on to Russia, and also the North Atlantic. In naval terms, the priority has to be both securing the Greenland, Iceland, UK gap against submarine incursions, and Russian submarines are operating at a much higher intensity than they have in decades, and also maintaining the Atlantic supply routes from the United States to Europe, which is absolutely crucial to Europe's ability to hold back Russian ambitions and aggression. And equally, you're seeing that the UK, having talked about and spent vast sums of money on relocating back from Germany, are now having to re-enter and re-establish bases and forward basing in Germany, precisely because of the pressure, not just in Ukraine, which is the current trigger point, but also, of course, with the Baltics, with Poland, with Belarus being increasingly reincorporated into the Soviet Union, and also even pressure on the Scandinavian countries as well. That inevitably, by geography, will be the UK's prime focus. In no way, by the way, to detract from the importance of Indo-Pacific and also our relations with countries in that region, not least yourselves, but also, of course, now including Japan and India, but Australia, for a whole number of security and defence reasons and historic reasons, obviously being a prime focus.
And you have the added feature, John, in the Arctic Circle, which you didn't have previously, of China and other countries being determined to enter that sphere in a way that they weren't simply capable of doing previously. So that's a new tension for Great Britain in its north.
Well, also, I mean, Russia, having had, you're right about China taking a renewed interest and claiming to be involved, but also Russia becoming increasingly assertive there, not least as, of course, sea routes open up and some land areas become more available, and the huge raw materials sources that are available.
No doubt about it.
Can
Teresa,
I come in on that as well?
Yep.
Can I come in on that as well briefly? I think John Speller is absolutely right that the Arctic is going to become a much bigger foreign policy issue over the years to come, because for the reasons that he said about assertiveness from Russia and China and potential sort of issues that creates, but also because climate change means that there are routes and possibilities that are opened up in that area which have never existed before. So I have a particular interest in polar regions, and what I am hoping is that we see a stronger focus in the future in terms of UK foreign and defence policy on those crucially important Arctic questions that John's just spoken about.
Do you feel that the UK understands that and is focusing on polar regions, Teresa, because it's very much in their interest to do so, and that would bring in Canada, of course, to their considerations, which is a close friend of Britain's?
I think that it is taken very seriously, but I think possibly we will need a further tilt in that direction over the coming years. I do think that's an area where more will need to be done in the future.
Because Russian submarines have been sighted even further south than they had been previously in just recent weeks, in fact.
Well,
I wasn't aware of that, but it doesn't surprise me.
The submarines have also been taking a very intense and unhealthy interest in the cables across the Atlantic. And for all the talk about satellites, something like 95% of the traffic, digital traffic between North America and the UK actually go through those cables. And it's an area of great concern and potential vulnerability. And it's so particularly in the grey zone of warfare, which we're seeing increasingly, Russia engaging in.
I might just turn to back to the Indo-Pacific, because Britain, of course, has been an Indo-Pacific power, having given up Hong Kong, 25 years ago, at least 25 years ago, to the Chinese. In the last year or two, we've seen Hong Kong being in many ways more integrated into China than the promised one country, two systems. And really the most significant flashpoint in the Indo-Pacific at the moment is Taiwan, who have been viewing what's happened in Hong Kong with great interest, as I'm sure you're all aware. France has maintained assets in the Indo-Pacific, physical assets, especially in the South Pacific. Do you feel that in Britain that there is a regret that it has given up territories across the Indo-Pacific that it previously held, maybe for good reason, but do you feel that there's a regret that that's happened?
Not really.
No,
I don't think it really. I don't think it really features. Now it may increase, and there is clearly contestability with China. Although, interestingly enough, many of the Pacific Islands, as you know, are becoming very skeptical about the Chinese offer, because they're finding that there is no such thing as Chinese foreign aid. There are soft, in inverted commas, low interest loans, but in the end, the Chinese then want them repaid, or as with Sri Lanka and more recently with Uganda, then grab domestic assets in payment for them. And also, of course, they bring in Chinese companies and Chinese workers, and there's very little gain to the sustainability of the local economy. And that's going to be part of the hearts and minds. But if you're asking a straightforward question, is there any great salience in the UK about this? The answer is, I have to say, I don't think there is. But I think precisely as you're saying about Taiwan, that this will start to move up in the level of public consciousness.
Mike, you want to
just to add, I agree with John. I think, putting it bluntly, the scales have dropped off the eyes of many people. If you go back 8-10 years, the Cameron government, the coalition with the Liberal Democrats, that government had a strategy of encouraging Chinese investment into various sectors in the UK economy. Huawei was mentioned, the nuclear power, there was a whole range. And of course, some of those members of that government have subsequently gone on to work for the Chinese International Bank. And we are in a completely different mindset now. And the putting it bluntly, the scales are also dropping off in terms of foreign policy, the Belt and Road imperialism of the party state. It is being seen for what it is. The Ring of Pearls and the attitudes that China has adopted, aggressive attitudes to countries that criticize it, whether it is Australia or whether it's some European countries like Lithuania. You're in a situation where this bullying attitude, there will be serious consequences. I first heard that when I took a Foreign Affairs Select Committee a delegation to China in 15 years ago, and they found out we were going to go to Taiwan, and they were, there will be serious consequences, we were told. We didn't have any consequences, but another Select Committee had its visit refused a few months later, and that's their whole attitude, and it hasn't changed. It's not just Xi Jinping. It's the nature of the party state and lack of pluralism, and we've seen it in Hong Kong. And I think more and more British people are now aware of this, and I think in the parties as well, there'll be less illusions in government about China and its policies.
Could I be uncharacteristically charitable?
Christopher, can I jump in there?
Yeah. I was going to actually be charitable to the last Conservative government, to David Cameron and Theresa May on this, because if I could just briefly, because this was a received wisdom, not just in commercial circles where they were all just looking at the money to be made, but let's be fair, also the security advice that ministers were getting. There was a groupthink amongst the security services that as China became richer, developed a middle class, they would want many of the freedoms in the West, and therefore there would be a natural evolution with which we could engage. They underestimated, but I said, to be fair, this was the advice they were getting, and not just from the Foreign Office mandarins, but it underestimated the resilience of a Communist Party state.
Yeah, Christopher, I'm going to jump in here, and unfortunately, this will need to be my last contribution because I have to go and chair a committee in a moment. But I do agree both with John and Mike there, and I was a member of the David Cameron government where we were very, very deliberately seeking to make China a strategic commercial partner. We were almost every month sending trade delegations out there, government ministers. And I think it is fair to say that there was a complacency, a groupthink about the trajectory that China was on. And I think John just described that very well. There was a kind of the received wisdom was that there was this kind of automatic path of development where prosperity would inevitably be accompanied by greater openness and freedoms, and there'd be a kind of converging of values and interests, which meant that China could be a reliable partner for the long term. I think there has been a rather sober reassessment of that in recent years. It doesn't mean that we and Theresa kind of said it in her opening remarks actually earlier in the session. I think it'd be a mistake to think that we need to be erecting barriers between ourselves and China. China are here for the long term. They're a major manufacturer, a huge strategic player, and we have to find a way of having a grown-up, mature relationship with that regime that serves our interests. And that's going to be a very, very difficult challenge for ourselves, for you guys in Australia, particularly for the Americans as well, recalibrating those relationships for the world that we're in. I just want to come back to this point as well, Christopher, about military assets in the Indo-Pacific and the geography. And we've touched on in the discussion this morning some important points about where the future might take us in terms of British naval strategy. But I just want to make the point that the kind of struggles that we're talking about aren't just about military assets and geographical location. We've just been talking about China. One of the biggest battles we have as a nation is in our universities. If you look at the way China has very deliberately extended its influence over UK universities, of course, they're a big customer of UK universities with the number of students they send here, but the way they're shaping some of the courses and the curriculum, it's very quiet, it's very away from the public spotlight, but it's really pernicious. And in boardrooms across the UK as well, in our manufacturing sector, in some of our key utilities, power sector, energy, the Chinese influence has been there. So for Britain, in terms of our kind of relationship with China, we need to find ways to recalibrate and to limit what China is seeking to do where it's not in our interests.
They're all good points.
Thank you, Christopher. I'm going to have to shoot.
And thank you very much for joining us too. Teresa, did you want to comment on that?
No, I think everyone's covered the key points.
Everybody was praising you see, so I thought you might want to pile on. So looking at a different...
Could I just throw in one point, which following on from what Stephen was saying, and I remember a number of years ago talking to the foreign minister of a ASEAN country and posing some questions about China, and he enigmatically replied, but actually very revealingly says, China is a fact. And that's what our policy has to be, and that ties in with what Mike was saying as well. We've got to engage with China, but we've got to do it with very open eyes and with very, very clear resolve. Just one other point about China. I do not think we should believe that China is utterly monolithic, or even that the Communist Party of China is utterly monolithic. If we go back to the Mao era, where where the contests were violent within, the reason Mao had to keep purging the party was because there were very different views about the direction that the party and the country was taking. And if there is a view that Xi has moved too far from the Deng Xiaoping slow evolution path, and is therefore basically, in communist jargon, guilty of adventurism, then I think that there could easily be a fraction within the party, and it may well be that is there, possibly based around Shanghai, which is an enormously important part of China's economy. So I think we should also be looking at the internal divisions, not over-exaggerating, because the grip of the centre is still strong, but that doesn't mean it doesn't have the capacity also to fracture.
Yeah, John, I've been saying in speeches in recent months, in fact longer than recent months, that I'd be very surprised if there isn't a party in Beijing that is planning right now and drafting policies right now for China to step back from a number of the policies that it's pursued in the last 12 months or 2 years, because the effect of China and its attitude recently to, say, Australia has been to actually cause the ASEAN nations to band closer together and seek to be closer to their former friends like the US and Australia and India, whereas under the boiling the frog slowly policy of previous regimes in Beijing, of course, a lot of those countries thought that China was not nearly as scary as it's proving to be at the moment. So I think I don't disagree with anything that you said, which is quite frightening, actually, considering we're in completely different political parties.
Well, maybe an indication if they ever let Po Xilai out.
Yes. Now, I wouldn't mind talking a little bit in the last few minutes about Ukraine and Europe, because obviously global Britain, for many of us in other parts of the world, means that Britain will be looking beyond Europe. But at the point that was made before by John Speller was a strong one, which is that Britain's interests still very much lie in Europe and the North Atlantic. And so we wouldn't want to confuse global Britain for that, meaning that they're turning their back on their own backyard and focusing instead on ours, which is the Indo-Pacific. So comments about Ukraine, Russia, what might happen, what could Britain do, what could Europe do in the event of a Russian regime that oversteps the mark? Who'd like to go first? We'll make this our last subject, so you've got plenty of time if you want to.
Well,
sorry, Teresa, go on.
Teresa.
I'd happily come in on that. I mean, clearly we need to gather a strong global coalition to implement sanctions which are tough and will make a difference, to be imposed if we see Russia engaging in the sort of aggressive expansionist approach to Ukraine as it's already demonstrated in relation to Crimea. And I think some positive steps towards building that coalition were made in the Liverpool conference of G7 ministers. But this is in a way a test for the international community. It's a classic situation where free and democratic countries need to stand together shoulder to shoulder to say that certain activities by countries are unacceptable and that they will have significant economic consequences. And I think, some really tough measures around finance and banking could be extremely helpful in this context if we do see Russia, taking military action against Ukraine. They were for several years very significant in applying pressure on Iran. So I think it is worthwhile to consider deploying them because of the huge headaches they will cause potentially for Russian business if implemented.
John and Mike.
Well, I can. Sorry, Mike.
John, no, please.
No, I was going to briefly come in and say that we ought to be very strongly acting in support of the Budapest Agreement, where Ukraine gave up nuclear weapons in response to assurances, including from Russia, the United States, and the UK, of their sovereign integrity. It's slightly concerning that Ukraine are having to report that Germany is blocking the supply of some crucial weapons, defensive weapons to them, although slightly reassuring that all the indications are that the United States and the UK and others are seeking to fill that gap without this having to go formally through NATO. But there does need to be a very strong response, including military prepositioning, in order to indicate to Putin that these are moves that will not be sanctioned. Of course, we then enter into the grey area, in which we are going to have to spend much more time on, in terms of information warfare, disinformation, and also disruption of utilities, etc. But we have to recognise this is the new reality, and that's why it has to be a focus of British and NATO interest, because it's not just about Ukraine, important though that is, but also crucially important to three members of the EU and NATO in the Baltic states, and another member of the EU, although not a member of NATO, although very cooperative, in Finland as well as what we're seeing with Belarus using refugees in order to put internal pressure onto Europe. In fact, I was with a NATO delegation last month. Actually, we went up to the border, and it is chillingly reminiscent of the Cold War, with the no man's land, the razor wire, and now, of course, with modern cameras, etc. But that is the new reality. We have to be resolute. Otherwise, the price we pay will be very significant.
Mike, and then we might go to Alan Howe for any questions that he's got.
Just add to the last two contributions. Ukraine is, of course, in a very difficult position because NATO Article 5 guarantees don't apply. If there was any Russian attack on the Baltic states, there is a collective security NATO Article 5 commitment there, and we of course have British troops in Estonia. The Ukrainians clearly are in a much better position internally than they were in 2014. Their armed forces are stronger. The government has got more popular support, I think, and with all the problems that they've got, that I'm pretty sure they could resist the Russians quite strongly. But nevertheless, Putin is positioned 150,000 is the figure I saw. I don't know if that's accurate, but troops on the border, and he's clearly either doing it to exert concessions from Joe Biden at some international level, or to try and carry on being noticed, or it's a preparation for another military incursion and annexation of territory. Nobody can be sure about that, but we've got to robustly say there will be a very strong response. And Teresa mentioned the financial side. Well, of course, we hold a lot of cards if we were prepared to clamp down on a lot of the dirty money that is still in London. The Foreign Affairs Committee a few years ago produced a report called Moscow's Gold, which talked about that. And there are British companies, law firms, accountants who have been facilitating many of this laundering of money that comes out of criminal enterprises and people connected to the Kremlin through London's financial institutions. And if we did more on that, we could put the screws on quite effectively on some of the people around Putin, and that might act as a bigger deterrent than anything else that might be done.
Thank you, Mike. Now, Alan Howe, any questions from the audience that we could that you'd like to put to the panel?
Yes, thanks, Chris, and good to see you again.
Good to see you. I can't see you actually, but nice
I'm invisible at the moment. But and good to encounter my old mate John Spellar again. We crossed paths quite literally on the picket line outside Wapping in 1986. I was strike breaking. He was throwing bricks, one of which I caught, and I've kept to this day. John, the communications cables across the Atlantic, and you're suggesting they could be easily sabotaged. In what way are they protected?
Well, with great difficulty, because basically you put a trench and you put the cables down. And, you know, there's a great mass of these across and a very wide area. And so therefore, the only way effectively protecting it is by nuclear submarines and other methods of dealing with invasive submarines. That's why, keeping control of the Greenland, Iceland, UK gap is so important in this in preparations against hostile activity. And also, we need to be looking at what forms of deterrence that we would implement in the event of action being taken. But it's a matter of growing concern.
And John, also, you mentioned when discussing British industrial capacity and defence problems, defence procurement problems, that the problem lay in Whitehall. What is that problem?
It's a fundamental problem of hostility to British industry and an obsession with cheapest is best short term. And you can look at the cost that we're paying. That, for example, with PPE equipment at the start of the pandemic, they hadn't been keeping the supplies properly maintained. They didn't have capacity. They were resolutely resistant to offers from companies who produced fairly similar equipment for the commercial sector. And then they were paying multiples of 10 or 20 times to fly equipment into the UK. There is this absolute dogma. I remember saying when I was a government minister in defence to civil servants who were quite good, saying, look, if you behaved the way that I see your German, French and Italian counterparts behaving in terms of supporting their industry, the British public would be much more relaxed about Europe. But you insist on this theoretical model, which doesn't work. I want you to be good Europeans, I said, and behave as they do and support our industry. And there is this deep ideology in the Treasury and in the civil service. And I've heard Labour ministers saying, "Oh look, can't do that because we've got to set an example." Unfortunately, it's an example that nobody else wanted to follow, and that has hollowed out a lot of British industry, but also made us vulnerable on supply chain. But all countries also have found that at the third, fourth, and fifth tiers, they're finding that they're so dependent now on China in particular, but other less reliable countries as well, for those components that are absolutely crucial. And you're seeing this possibly with rare earths as well, that we need to be looking at right the way through the supply chain, looking at resilience, because the price we pay in loss of security, but also actually in being held to ransom, can in the future, but even now at the present, be very considerable.
Thank you, John. I'd like to ask the next question of Mike Gapes and Teresa Villiers. We just heard Stephen Crabb, it's a shame he's gone, talk about the relationship between this government and that of Israel being the closest ever. With that in mind, if Five Eyes were to become Six Eyes, might Israeli be that set of six eyes? Or have Israeli leaders been too close to Vladimir Putin in the past?
I think this is obviously a complicated question. And it would require, I assume, a consensus of all five to make a change to go to six. And I'm not sure necessarily that you would get that consensus. And I think formalizing it in that way might not be the best approach either. There are issues, unfortunately, about Russia's role in various countries. But Five Eyes is a specific and very important body, which I'm not sure widening it necessarily will actually make it more effective than the current cooperation that goes on anyway with certain other non-Five Eye countries.
Teresa, can I get your thoughts on that?
Shall I come in on that as well? I'm afraid I have to apologise. I'm very constrained in what I can say about intelligence and security matters because I sit on something called the Intelligence and Security Committee. So I really honestly don't feel able to answer your question directly because of the very strict rules to which committee members are subjected. But what I will say is that the Five Eyes partnership is hugely important to our safety and security right across all its members. It is unique in the world in the closeness of those relationships. And I think adding to it, therefore, is very difficult. I think to build up that degree of trust and closeness sufficient to turn it into a Six or Seven Eyes arrangement would be very difficult. But apologies for not being able to go into further detail on that. I might end up falling foul of the Official Secrets Act if I do.
Teresa, while I've got you, you said that earlier that China is a difficult foreign policy challenge. And, it could be a defence challenge to us one day very soon as well. Now, we in Australia are having a huge debate right now, very fierce, about whether or not we're obliged to join any US military action in defence of Taiwan. In fact, our Minister of Defence said last month, I should say, that it was inconceivable that we would not be involved militarily in the defence of Taiwan if the US were to do so. Where does the UK stand on that?
Well, I think it would be a massive step to be involved in a military conflict of that nature, and I very much doubt the UK would do that. Obviously, in terms of Australia's involvement, that is really a matter for you, but I would see it as pretty much inconceivable that the UK would become militarily involved in the Taiwan question.
Okay, Christopher Pine, you're not off the hook. We don't often ask the chairman questions, but there's an important one to be asked. And it was mentioned by both Mike Gapes and Stephen Crabb earlier on. Now, there are tens of thousands of Chinese students in Australia and in the UK paying for their educations. That's all good. It's a good export business for us. But also, haven't we assumed that as part of that relationship and part of that business, that we also export back to China the strengths of liberal democracy? Given what's happening in China right now, have we failed?
Yes, we have failed. And I think we've all failed, by the way. The West, John commented on earlier, the West strongly believed, I think, genuinely believed that if we embraced China and did business with China economically and helped lift their people from poverty, which we've done in hundreds of millions of Chinese nationals, which has been a remarkable achievement since the Second World War. But even in the last 25 years, I think it was certainly the policy of the Howard government and subsequent governments and the British governments that we would, by example and by dint of increasing the size of the Chinese middle class, that they would see the benefits to liberal democracy. That has not been successful. And that's what we're facing now. And it's disappointing to us all, Alan. I would hope that the Xi period will come to an end when it comes to an end, which it inevitably does, or we know it lasts forever, that there will be a resetting of the attitudes of the Chinese Communist Party to its own people, and they will loosen and embrace liberal principles. But you'd have to say the sort of post-Deng period to the beginning of the Xi period, there were reasons for us to be cautiously optimistic. That hasn't been the case in the last 5 or 6 years, and I don't think it's going to get better for some time.
Thank you, Christopher.
Alan, thank you. I'm glad I got a question. I've still got it in my retirement. Can I thank you, Mike Gapes and John Speller, Teresa Villiers and Stephen Crabb in his absence for joining us here on the dialogue for a fascinating subject on global Britain. We went in many different directions, which was particularly interesting. And thank you all very much for giving us your time. And I'm happy to hand back the agenda to our chairman,